Hello, and welcome to the Moosnick Lecture in Judaic Studies. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Leslie Ribovich, and I'm Assistant Professor of Religion at Transylvania University. With the support of the Rosenthal and Moosnick families, as well as the Lexington Theological Seminary and the Jewish community of Central Kentucky, the Monroe Moosnick Lecture Series was established years ago as an opportunity for interfaith dialogue. Transylvania University is now pleased to host these events. In past years, the Moosnick has welcomed such speakers as Rabbi Dr. Mira Wasserman and Dr. Susanna Heschel. This year, our theme is Jewishness and Whiteness, the implications of this relationship for Jews of color, and the offering of alternative ways of engaging the Jewish tradition that is more inclusive. To explore this theme, Dr. Amanda Beckenstein Mbuvi, Vice President for Academic Affairs at Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, will be presenting a talk titled, Who Sees Themselves in Jewish Children's Books? A Transracial Adoption Story and the Common Sense of Jewish Identity in the USA. We are honored for the Moosnick Lecture to address this important subject and to invite such an esteemed guest. For our Transy Religion program, which in recent years has restructured our major to uplift Jewish voices and the voices of people of color, very much including Jews of color, we can't think of a more apt topic to engage with students who are already thinking about intersections of race and religion, especially in spaces that are not Christian. Before I introduce Dr. Mbuvi, there are a number of people I would like to welcome to today's event and thank for their contributions. I'm thrilled to thank our coordinating committee, Nora Rose Moosnick, Dr. Loida Martel, Rabbi David Wertschafter, Rabbi Shani Abramowitz, Dr. Beth Goldstein, and Dr. Carol Barnsley. Their efforts over the last year are significant, and we're grateful for their time and energy. Thanks also to Transylvania University for hosting this event tonight, especially President Brian Lewis and Dean Rebecca Thomas. As a liberal arts institution that cultivates independent thinking, open-mindedness, and creative expression among students, Transylvania is an ideal location for these important conversations. Thanks also to Megan Maloney and Julie Martinez in communications for making this virtual platform possible, and to Charlene Harris, Transy's humanities administrator, for all her work in publicizing and coordinating the event. In addition to tonight's lecture, Dr. Mbuvi will be speaking again by Zoom tomorrow at 7 p.m. in a talk titled Avadim Hayinu, an intersectional Jewish perspective on diversity and solidarity, hosted by Ohavay Zion's Synagogue. I encourage you all to attend. And just a couple quick logistical notes. There is both a Q&A and a chat box for questions to Dr. Mbuvi that you would like her to respond to at the end of her talk. Please use the Q&A section. That will be available to moderators and to Dr. Mbuvi. There will also be some moments where Dr. Mbuvi invites you to comment. For that, please use the chat box and that will be available for all to see. And just there's also closed captioning on this available for those who are interested. Now, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Mbuvi as the speaker of this year's Moosnick Lecture in Judaic Studies. Dr. Mbuvi is a scholar of Hebrew Bible, author and teacher with a wellspring of academic, administrative, and nonprofit leadership experience. As Vice President for Academic Affairs, Dr. Mbuvi oversees the academic program and a curriculum that combines rigorous academic learning with intensive community building and field training. Dr. Mbuvi subscribes to a holistic approach to rabbinic education, one that equips students to bring out new possibilities for the world. Dr. Mbuvi is the first Jew of color to lead an American rabbinical school. She is dedicated to further increasing diversity within the rabbinate, ensuring that the profession more accurately reflects the full human diversity of Jewish communities that students graduate and serve. In addition to numerous scholarly articles, Dr. Mbuvi is the author of the 2016 book, Belonging in Genesis, Biblical Israel and the Politics of Identity Formation, which was published by Baylor University Press. In this work, she demonstrated how acts of storytelling and transmission define community. Dr. Mbuvi takes an interdisciplinary approach to biblical studies, engaging questions of identity and community that are as present in the biblical text as they are in contemporary society. Most recently, Dr. Mbuvi served as assistant professor of religion at High Point University in North Carolina. And in addition to her academic work, she has coordinated many things, including an adult literacy program in North Carolina. She served on the board of Beth David Synagogue and the B'nai Shalom Day School in Greensboro, North Carolina, and is a former member of the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Greensboro Jewish Federation. So as we can see, she's very involved in community scholarship and teaching. Dr. Mbuvi earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy and literary theory from Bryn Mawr College, a master of theological studies degree from Palmer Theological Seminary, and both a PhD in religion and a certificate in nonprofit management from Duke University. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mbuvi.
Okay, good evening. It's good to be with you, virtually as it is. I'm glad to have this time with you. And I hope to give you some things to think about and to have a little discussion afterward. So I'm going to go right to sharing my screen so we can dive right in. Here we go. Okay, so I wanted to start again by having us think a little bit about this title. Who sees themselves in Jewish children's books? People talk about this idea of people seeing themselves, seeing people who look like themselves. And I want us to dig in a little bit into what exactly people mean when they say that. What's going on when we use those phrases? And in talking about the common sense of Jewish identity in the US, I'm talking about something very specific. So we're looking at a children's book because it's very good at helping us think about this common sense. And when I say common sense, I'm following Antonio Gramsci, who uses the term to designate ways of thinking that are so pervasive as to be invisible and so deeply ingrained as to appear incontestable, requiring or admitting no discussion. So common sense, it's the things that we don't even think to articulate. It's the things we don't even think to question. They're the things about the world that just seem to be how things are. And children's books are really helpful for thinking about this because they're articulating things that people don't usually bother to put into words. So why this particular book? Because it makes this common sense of identity accessible so that parents can effectively reproduce it in new generations. So one of the things that children's books do is they help us explain things to children, to our children, things we may not know how to put into words. It gives us language to express things about daily life. And at the same time, by making visible processes that usually operate invisibly, it also provides a means of challenging common sense and creating space for new perspectives on communal identity to emerge. So when we see it, we can think about it. And once we think about it, we can decide if this is the perspective we really want or if we want to make some space for something new. So we're going to focus especially on two scenes in the book. And we have some readers who are going to read this for us.
Every night during the previous year, when the sun had set, the Steins would stand around the Shabbat table. It was set with candlesticks, grape juice, and 2 loaves of challah. Delicious smells from the kitchen would be in the air. The family would sing
Shalom
Aleichem.
welcoming Shabbat, and Mr. and Mrs. Stein would bless their children.
Don't forget baby Rebecca.
Jacob had reminded them last week, and so Mr. and Mrs. Stein had faced toward Vietnam, held their hands atop an imaginary little head, and said the traditional blessing for little girls.
May God make you kind, righteous, like the first mothers of our people, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah.
Even though baby Rebecca wasn't Jewish yet, receiving her parents' blessing was a good first step.
Soon, baby Rebecca won't be Vietnamese anymore.
We're not quite, just this page, just this one page.
Sorry.
That's okay. We'll just start with this page for now, because there's a lot going on here. And so in the illustration that goes along with what they just read, we see the Stein family. We see Mr. and Mrs. Stein, their 2 sons. We see a table with challah, Shabbat candlesticks, a glass of wine. And the Steins are blessing their children. So the first feature of this book that I want to highlight is the way that it depicts the process of becoming family. And that's something that this scene encapsulates very well. So one thing we can notice is that it expresses this idea that family is always constructed, whether families grow through adoption or pregnancy. So for example, when it looks at baby Rebecca, the first kind of ritual that marks the baby becoming part of the family, it's interesting that it's not some sort of conversion ritual, but it's a ritual that the whole family does every Friday night. So the sons that are not adopted and the daughter that is adopted experience the ritual in the same way. There's no differentiating. So by practicing this ritual together, by the parents blessing the children, by the children receiving the blessing, what they're demonstrating is that family, the ways that family isn't just something that sort of passively happens, but that people actively live into their familial roles by performing rituals like this and by engaging in the daily life of being a family. And what this scene also illustrates for us very nicely is that story and ritual are the means by which family is constructed. So it's significant that here they're using a ritual to pass this along. In other situations, people also construct family through the stories about what it means to be a member of that family. So it's not just kind of being passively connected to a group of people, but it's the way that people communicate what it means to be part of a family, what it means to be part of a group of people. And so beyond the kind of legalities of adoption, becoming part of a family in the way that matters most is something that's enacted in this book through this Shabbat ritual that becomes the first moment that the baby really becomes part of the family, even before that she's arrived. And Elizabeth Stone here is a theorist of family storytelling. And she explains, each of us is the product of a confluence of strangers. We come from two families, not one, even if we look only as far back as our parents. And so the blood that coursed through a great-grandparent or even a grandparent is but a thin trickle in our own. So what Stone is communicating here is that we talk about blood oftentimes as being the sort of the symbol of the family. But what Stone is pointing out is if we really think about this idea, if we really kind of dig into it, it doesn't really make sense because families are always diverse. Families are always created from diversity. They're always created from people coming together who were not previously a family. And so what it is that makes a family and that binds them is not actually blood. It's the culture that a family creates together. It's a life that the family creates together. Okay. So now we're ready for the next scene of the book. And this scene takes place, we have the two boys in bed. The mother is kind of leaning over them, and on the wall, we have a poster of Israel and another poster of Vietnam. And we're ready for the readers. Oh wait, hold one moment. As the readers read, I want to encourage you to think about what stands out to you in this scene. What do you notice in this scene, and put your observations in the chat.
Soon, baby Rebecca won't be Vietnamese anymore. She'll be Jewish.
Abe said he was 4 years old and wanted to be an astronaut when he grew up. He had told his preschool class all day about baby Rebecca.
No, she'll be Vietnamese and Jewish,
said Jacob, who was almost 8.
You can be two things.
Jacob is right.
Said his mother.
You can be many things. Baby Rebecca will always be Vietnamese. Her hair will always be straight and black, her skin golden brown, and her eyes the shape of almonds. We'll read her stories about Vietnam to teach her that it is a special place. One day we will all visit her homeland, but she will also be a part of the Jewish people and will learn our history, celebrate our holidays, and visit Israel. And of course, she will be American.
Thank you. And I'm going to have to stop for a moment so I can actually see the chat. So enter into the chat what you notice in this excerpt from the book. Okay, yes, a focus on what the baby looks like. Talking about physical characteristics, thinking about the baby's different identities. Yes. Great, learning about community, place, the role of place, visiting Vietnam and Israel. Yes, they refer to Vietnam as a special place in the baby's life. Yes, and so they talk about being Jewish in terms of learning history, celebrating holidays, visiting Israel. Yeah, that they have the posters, that they're really trying to be inclusive. Yes, they're trying to be inclusive, and they also emphasize that the baby is different. I want to invite us to dig into that a little bit. I'm still going to be able to see the chat. Yes, I can still see it. Good. Okay. Yeah, there's so much going on. There's so much happening in this scene. Yes, multiple identities are possible, but some aren't always very compatible. Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, so one of the first things I want to call our attention to in this scene is ways that it's different than what we just saw in the Shabbat dinner scene. So here in this bedtime scene, in the Shabbat dinner scene, it really emphasized the way that the baby becomes a member of the family, just like her siblings, that there's no difference between the baby's membership in the family and Gabe and Jacob's membership in the family, that they're all children of the family in the same way. But in this scene, we see something different. All of a sudden, they're making a distinction between the baby's Jewishness and the Jewishness of the other members of the family. So in this case, they're debating the extent to which the circumstances of the baby's birth determine or constrain the baby's relationship to Jewishness. And so that leads to a distinction between the way in which the baby is Jewish and the way that the siblings are Jewish. Yeah, so. Okay, well, we'll go back here so we can see it. Okay, so one of the ways that this happens is that there's an emphasis on the baby having a Vietnamese identity because of the baby's body, that this identity resides in the body, and as long as the body doesn't change, the baby's identity doesn't change. What's interesting about that is that it also is the differences between the way that it handles the baby's relationship to place and the rest of the family's relationship to place. So demographically speaking, the Steins are probably 2-3 generations American of people that have been in this country, just going by sort of demographic trends of Jewish immigration. And yet in this page, in this scene, and in the entire book, the Steins' relationship to immigration is never discussed. So whatever place the Stein ancestors come from is never mentioned. It doesn't seem to play any significant role in their life. All the sort of identity markers in the book are focused on Jewish belonging. And there's this reference here to being American, but there's nothing at all about any other countries. So it's interesting to consider, well, if this baby is leaving Vietnam before she even remembers being there, why does it play such a decisive role in her identity if the rest of the family's history of immigration doesn't seem to play much of a significant role for them? So why is it so different? And the reason that this happens is because it's reflecting a characteristic way of thinking about Jewishness through a separation of racial and religious identity. That religious identity can change with a conversion, but racial identity is forever. And so really what they're getting at is not so much the baby's kind of history of immigration, but the baby being racially different. So culture consists of the collective processes that make the artificial seem natural. And what I want us to notice in this bedtime scene, do I have it again? If we go back to it? Nope. Okay, if we can go back to this bedtime scene here. So to focus in on the description that's given of baby Rebecca, that it says that baby Rebecca will always be Vietnamese because her hair will always be straight and black, her skin golden brown, and her eyes the shape of almonds. So it's very significant that these are the particular terms used to describe her identity, because these are terms to emphasize the baby's kind of racialization as Asian. And this point here, especially this eyes the shape of almonds, that is I don't want to do a poll, but I'm guessing that most people have heard that phrase before, almond shaped eyes. What's interesting about that is it isn't actually true. Someone actually did a study comparing pictures of eyes to pictures of almonds, and people who are Asian, their eyes look less like almonds than people who are white. And yet this idea persists of Asians having almond shaped eyes. And so part of what that reflects is the extent to which some of what we associate with race, it's not even because it's an accurate thing about the world, but it seems true because people keep saying it. And we keep hearing it, so we keep repeating it, even if it doesn't actually become an accurate way of thinking about what it describes. It's also interesting that when we look at the pictures of the book show all the different members of the Stein family. We don't see the baby yet, we'll get the baby soon. But they show all the members of the Stein family. And yet, even in this discussion about identity, there's no discussion about the identity of Mrs. Stein, Gabe, or Jacob Stein. There's no discussion of whiteness. Whiteness never is mentioned in the book at any point. Every description, every physical description is only of the baby. So as looking at this, not only as a book that we're analyzing, but thinking of this as a book that parents are reading with children, that part of what children are learning when reading this together is they're learning to kind of pay special attention to these features that are coded as Asian, and they're learning not to talk about whiteness. They're learning they're learning, and I mean specifically, they are learning to not talk about it. They're learning that it's not something that gets mentioned, that some people are more visible than others, that some bodies are more visible than others. So here we can see all of the family, right? So the book shows an example of all of the family. And so to kind of help us think about what's happening here, we can notice that, for example, all of the members of the family here are depicted with dark hair. Mrs. Stein and Jacob have brown hair, and Mr. Stein and Gabe have black hair. And the baby also has black hair. It's interesting to consider, why is it that the baby having darker skin is something that needs explanation in a way that, what if the baby had been blonde? How is that different from bringing somebody with a different kind of physical difference? What is it about this baby's physical difference that requires such a special effort to conceptualize and to make sense of? Go back to this for a moment. I also want us to think a little bit about the different options that are happening in this conversation. So when they're talking about the baby being two things, the possibility of being two things, Jacob initially says you can be two things, but then as the mother breaks it down, what comes out is the baby has to be two things because this is what her body's like. And we can kind of carry it forward. This is what her body's like. If her children's bodies are similar, will her children also be Vietnamese? How long will this persist, even if Vietnam plays no significant role in this baby's life? So what I'm not trying to talk about right now is sort of what role should the kind of the history of being internationally adopted play in the baby's life. I'm not trying to talk about that. I'm looking specifically at how the baby is represented as being Jewish and being American. So yes, so it's looking that this baby has to be a Vietnamese because this identity is written into her body. And it's specifically Vietnam, which is also interesting because this is a nation that came into being through a history of colonial intervention. So Vietnam has a number of ethnic groups, has a number of different ethnic groups within the country, and yet particular history is still described as being part of this baby's body at birth. So there's a kind of maneuver happening there that we tend to not even notice, that it can seem like, oh, sure, obviously, Vietnamese as an ethnic group, but we need to kind of dig into a little bit and sort of notice what's happening. Switch it again. Put this out of order. Okay, so I wanted to share this quote from Bible scholar Gail Yee, who points out that Asian Americans have not been fully assimilated into what it means to be American. Even though many, like my family, have been here for generations, the perception of being aliens in their own land is one that Asian Americans find difficult to shake off. They continue to be seen as more Asian than American. So while the intention of the family is very clearly to celebrate this child and to acknowledge the kind of diversity of the child's identity, the particular way in which this is playing out is something that actually emphasizes her otherness. It sort of emphasizes her as a as racially other. And this relates to the kind of history of ways that people think about religion in this country. So if we go back to the 1700s and kind of the early days of the United States, one of a debate that happened within Christianity is that people were trying to figure out what to do about slaves. So on the one hand, people felt like, well, as Christians, it was their job to encourage slaves to be Christians because people should be evangelizing and should be getting everyone to be Christian. But then they also realized if the slaves become Christian, then they would be brothers and sisters in Christ. And that would be awkward because they'd be slaves, but they'd be brothers and sisters in Christ. So the way they resolved it was to say, to change the rite of baptism, to change the rite of Christian initiation, to say, instead of just baptizing people in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, to add to that, at that moment, that baptism does nothing to change a person's social status. That it is a spiritual transaction that has nothing to do with a person's social status and doesn't change the status of a slave or what the slave owes to the slave owner in any way. And that idea of kind of religion and social identity being separate is something that is carried through and that even impacts American Judaism because it's so deeply ingrained in how Americans think about religion. Why it's so easy to think about someone changing their religion and so difficult to think about someone changing their race. To see that as something that just doesn't happen, this kind of different kinds of reality. And yet, if we look within Jewish tradition, when someone becomes Jewish, they also get a new genealogy. It's very significant that they become son or daughter or child of Abraham and Sarah. So even in Jewish tradition, there is this idea that you can change families, that you can change peoples. And in American Judaism, that idea has been, we've been limited in how we think about the implications of that idea because it goes so much against the grain of how we think about religion and race in this country. So going back for a moment, something else we can consider here. We can consider a different perspective. So one read is to say that we see the youngest child saying something, the older child saying something, the mother agreeing with the older child. We could read this, we could even sort of get a little metaphorical and we can read it as saying this idea that the baby won't be Vietnamese, but then we'll be Jewish instead. We'll stop being Vietnamese and start being Jewish. is a kind of older view of identity. It's the melting pot that people like to talk about in the past and not as much now. And that's been sort of replaced or transcended by this idea of like, no, you can have this multiplicity of identities. But we can also consider that, maybe there's another way of thinking about what the younger son is saying. So this idea that the baby will be Jewish. So if we really think seriously about him as the younger son, this is the first time he's seen anyone join the family. So presumably the older son had seen the younger son come home and someone becomes a part of the family. This is the first time the younger son is experiencing anything like that. So from his point of view, being 4 years old and maybe not knowing as much about the American rules of race, doesn't see why it makes a difference, why it's different for this baby's body to become part of the family than if the baby had lighter skin and blonde hair in a family of dark-haired people, why that would be any different. So it may be that this child's youth means that he's just less indoctrinated into common ways of thinking and sort of more open and more flexible in terms of how he's thinking about identity. So we can sort of say, well, what's wrong with that? So why not just say, okay, baby's just Jewish, period. Well, one problem with that way of looking at things is the fact that people are very likely to respond to the baby's physical characteristics and characterize her in a particular way. So however the baby identifies, self-identifies, or whatever kind of identity the baby cultivates, if people visually perceive her as Asian, then they will treat her accordingly. And there's stories of people, Korean adoptees, for example, who were raised as white by white parents, who've described the real pain of when they encounter people who do other than racially, and they weren't expecting it and they weren't prepared for it. And a lot of times their families didn't know how to help them, didn't know how to support them, had no way of doing that. So on the one hand, the advantage of what the mother's trying to do is that it acknowledges the reality that this baby will be living in, where people do notice certain things, certain bodily features, attribute certain meaning to them, and will treat her accordingly. But the reason that I want to suggest it's something that we want to think a step beyond is that in the mother's description, this process is just an inevitable reaction to the baby's body. That the baby is different in her body, therefore this is what she is. Instead of a way that people are choosing to assign meaning to and interpret the baby's body. Race now, we tend to experience the kind of rules of race as we currently live with them in this place and time as being sort of absolute and real, and yet they've actually changed over time. This idea of sort of one white race is something that's relatively recent in American history, that there was a time when people believed that Irish people and Italian people and Swedish people belonged to different races and were as visually distinct as any other racial groups now. And when people stopped caring as much about that as a racial distinction, people stopped noticing it as much. So historically, it's not that people see difference and then come up with what that difference means, but that they come up with meaning and then they notice that difference. That the meaning comes first and the noticing physical features come second. When people care about those features, they stand out and they pay more attention to them. And sort of ways that this shows up, in people's lives, for example. So here is a picture of Rabbi Sandra Lawson wearing a baseball cap and a t-shirt that says, "This is what Jewish looks like." And she is an African-American woman with short hair. And she explains, "Upon meeting me, Jews of Ashkenazi descent like to ask me a myriad of questions, from how are you Jewish to when did you convert? These questions never happen in a context of wanting to know me. They are about the questioner's own curiosity and trying to see how I fit into Judaism, as if by answering these questions, it will tell them everything they need to know about me. When people ask me these questions, I never know how to respond. I try to use my energy to educate other Jews about what it means to be Jewish in today's society, but sometimes it is really exhausting." So one thing I want to invite us to notice about this is she doesn't actually specify whether the people asking the questions are upset by her difference in some way or enthusiastic about it, that she doesn't actually make that distinction in this statement. And whether the person is sort of eager and excited, enthusiastic, or threatened and dismissive, that it still exerts a toll for people to always assume that she doesn't belong, that her Jewishness needs explanation. That as people kind of live that out, it's something that is difficult and is painful. And I'll even encourage us to think that, especially one of the things that we've been thinking about since the murder of George Floyd is that it's not even just a matter of personal discomfort. That one of the things that people of color are socialized to kind of realize is that when people perceive them as not belonging, it also means that they are often physically unsafe, because we see what happens when people assume that someone is not supposed to be there, that someone is doing something they shouldn't be doing, that the consequences that flow from that can be very drastic. And that's not that this happens in every situation, but if you even know that it's a possibility, knowing that it's something that always could happen, it really becomes something that shapes someone's experience. So what we have here, and I talked a little bit about the history of sort of identity in the US. So one way to kind of describe the sort of common sense of race here and kind of how it works is using this image of the social ladder. And this comes from Keenan Malik. And what he points out is that kind of older ideas about race, I'm going to call them older, even though I don't really know what's happening now, white supremacy and stuff, I'll say older for now. But older ideas about race where it's like this group is better than this group, is better than this group, then is better than this group. That's not so much in fashion anymore. But what's taken its place is basically this. We've turned the ladder on its side and it says, there are all these people and people are all different and everyone is equal. So at first it seems like this is a more inclusive approach because it's saying, hey, everyone is equal. But what we should notice about this is it's still the same structure as when it was standing up. And part of what's happening now is that it's still dividing people into this endless series of boxes. And each box is the same shape. And kind of what that implies is that every kind of identity is doing the same kind of work, that every kind of identity is somehow equivalent, and that identity lives in this series of boxes. And I think it's very significant that these boxes, you can compare them to the check boxes on a form when people are asked to provide their racial identity, always asked as one question with a list of boxes. It's notable that whenever people are trying to sort of classify identity, Jewish identity really trips people up because it's like, well, is it a race? Is it a religion? Is it ethnicity? Is it a culture? Like people always get a little stuck with it because of the ways that it doesn't just conform to one category or the other. It starts to reveal the limitations of this way of thinking, about identity. So I think there is a more fruitful perspective in this book, that this book also offers us for different ways of thinking about diverse identity and Jewishness. If I could get our readers to read again.
Now the baby had 3 names. She had a Vietnamese name, Lê Thi Hong. She had an English name, Rebecca Rose, and she had a Hebrew name, Rivka Shoshana. She was Vietnamese, American, and Jewish.
And she'll be many more things someday,
Mrs. Stein said.
Maybe a mother like you.
Jacob suggested.
Or an astronaut like me,
Gabe added.
Or a famous poet, Olympic skier, and mathematician all rolled into one,
Mr. Stein said with a smile.
You can't be all of those things.
Jacob protested.
You can be as many things as you want to be, or at least you can try.
His dad replied.
Thank you, readers. So what we can notice here in comparison to the other scene is here it's talking about identity in terms of names instead of categories. And this baby in this scene comes just after the baby has gone to the mikveh, that this baby now has 3 names, a Vietnamese name, an English name, and a Hebrew name. So one of the things that I think is helpful about names is that People can have as many names as they want, and everybody has a name. So instead of this baby sort of having a race and no one else has a race, everyone else is normal and this baby is Vietnamese, this baby has names and her siblings have names. And some Jews have English names and Hebrew names, and some Jews have just Hebrew names, and some Jew, so it doesn't limit identity. It provides a kind of an opening out into thinking about the layers of identity. In relation to Jewishness. And I meant to copy this poem to put it in the chat, but I didn't do it. But thinking about the poem by Zelda, right, that everyone has a name. So people, not only does everyone have a name, but people gain names from their families, people gain names from their life experiences, people have names that they give themselves, they have names that different groups of people call them, that it's a much more kind of flexible way of thinking about the layers of this baby's identity instead of thinking about it in terms of race. And so what I want to suggest is that race is something that is with us and is real, that people perceive race, they react to race. It has been a significant part of shaping our history. So I'm not suggesting that we just sort of like, race is gonna, make it go away. But I think we have to realize that it comes from a choice that people are making. It is not just a fact of bodies. It is a choice that people make about how to assign meaning to different bodies. And when we see it as a choice, then we're empowered to choose differently. We're empowered to think, well, is this the choice we want to make? Or do we want to make some other kinds of choices? And I like to compare it to thinking about a language. So there are sounds that, say, English speakers, native English speakers, if they're only native English speakers, there's sounds in other languages that we just can't say, it's just hard to get our mouths to do it. It just does not go well. But that doesn't mean that other people in other countries can't make those sounds perfectly readily. We're just not used to it. And if we think about what we've seen with Hebrew, for example, that you can actually bring a language back. And maybe, one generation, we can never quite get the sound to come out right. And the next generation gets a little better and the next generation is fluent. I think the same is with ideas about race. It's really hard to just sort of shake off all the training that we've gotten from our society about how to perceive and interpret and respond to race. But as we sort of intentionally open up space to think differently, we can actually work towards building something different in the future and not just assume that the rules that sort of currently govern society sort of have to be there forever, but that we can help them evolve into something that's more inclusive and more productive. So with that, I'd really like to hear your questions.
So thank you so much for that. That was really quite enlightening, actually. And I'm sure I'll be able to articulate a question of my own at some point. But I wanted to give precedence to the questions in the Q&A. And we have a question from Bruce Engel. How well are Ethiopian Israelis accepted by the Israelis of European descent? Interesting that neither group had to convert, both were born Jewish.
Yeah, so I'm being careful to focus specifically on the US context, not to say that there aren't parallels to other places, but just to realize that the histories that have shaped how people perceive these issues in the US context, while similar, are not identical in other places. And so there's a different kind of set of considerations that sort of shape how people think about identity in Israel, and it's a little different. There are related issues, but not enough to sort of fully carry over
I was just wondering, what are you seeing, or what have you seen in terms of other stories for children, either about adoption into Jewish families? Are there other examples, and how does this one sort of fit into some of the common tropes that you maybe see in those stories?
So there aren't, last time I looked, I haven't looked again recently, like just now. So there might be some new stuff that came out. So this book is a PJ Library book, and people in the Jewish community may be familiar with this. PJ Library is a program that sends free Jewish children's books to kids. It sends kids free Jewish children's books. And this, at least as of last year, was still their sort of go-to on adoption and international adoption and transracial adoption, that there wasn't something sort of new in this category for this age group. Initially, I got interested in this book because my daughter brought it home from school. And initially, my initial reaction was to want to argue with it, to focus on the ways that it talked about race that I didn't agree with. But as I spent more time with it, one of the things I really came to appreciate is how kind of Talmudic it is in the way that it presents all of this in dialogue. So we don't have to have a reading that just says, well, kids say something, the mother says something, the mother's position is the book's position. It gives us these different perspectives and just invites us to consider them. And also thinking about what it means that it's a read-along book. It's got pictures, it's for kids. The words in it are not words that small kids are likely to read on their own. So it's probably a book that parents are reading to children. And so that also means it's a book that starts conversation in families for people to talk about what they're seeing and to ask more questions and to argue with it and to, as kids do, and to fixate on different things. But I think there's definitely room for more stories to be told for this age group.
Wonderful, thank you so much.
Dr.
And also really interesting. Another thing, I was thinking about the connections between your previous work and this work, and you're still calling it Talmudic. I was just had thoughts. I know it's a different context, but I just had thoughts. I see we have a question here from Karen Esme, and yes, as Dr. Barnsley said, please do put questions in the chat. And also, students, I can see that you're here, and I know you had questions in class, so I'm just saying that. Okay, so Karen May says, isn't this a freeing of people's identities beyond male, female, mother, father, widens the possibilities for each person, even in relationship to our ancestors' heritage? We can celebrate the wide diversity. Is that problematic for the Jewish tradition? Should Jewish faith be prominent? Yeah, and I place Christian Presbyterian as an important part of my identity, but not the complete picture.
Yeah, there's a lot here. There's a lot going on here.
And there's another version that Karen just said in the chat for us is Jewishness primary identity among others. And maybe I wonder if you can maybe think about that in relationship to, in that text, what we're seeing, and then if there are other examples.
Yeah. I think what's at stake is not so much the role of Jewish identity in relation to other identities or other kinds of identities, or like that last page where like the mathematician and the skier and all of those kinds of things. What I see at stake is the idea that the baby is Vietnamese and Jewish and the siblings are just Jewish. That distinction is being made. So it's not so much in kind of how Jewishness is held in relation to other things, but that it's how the baby and the siblings are considered to inhabit Jewish identity differently, and how there's a sense in which saying that the baby is Vietnamese and Jewish, the way that sort of plays out in that scene, I think, is to say that I think it plays out as sort of marking the baby as other in Jewish community. And it's not because the baby has a layered identity. It's not, or if the baby chooses to have a layered identity, right? It's not because of that, but it's this idea that the baby is something in Jewish and other people are just Jewish. And my experience of sort of how that plays out practically is that people really instead of considering that everybody has a cultural history, everybody has an experiential history, everybody has all kinds of layers of identity, or to, our Reconstructionist idea, thinking about living in two civilizations, but that this is something true of everybody, that is presented as something that's only true of some people, but not others. And what that practically looks like, thinking about the story from Rabbi Lawson, and what I've also seen is that when people say Vietnamese and Jewish, they sort of mean Vietnamese or Jewish. Like it's like a child of divorced parents. Like on the weekends you're Vietnamese and then on Wednesdays you're Jewish. Like people just have a really hard time understanding those things live in the same person, in the same place at the same time, that everyone is always both, that it stays separate in people's heads, that they sort of accept that someone can have sort of like two things, but not the oneness of the person inhabiting those identities. So I think it's important to kind of recognize that everyone has a complicated identity, not just some people. And important to notice sort of the tension between the language of choice that they keep using, like you can be two things, but then the explanation's like, no, you have to be two things because there's this race and you can't change it. But only the baby has a race that can't be changed. No one else in the family does, just this baby.
Yeah, I was fascinated by the part where you were talking about how certainly when we look at within America and within the United States, that race is understood a little bit differently here. And I loved where you said the meaning comes first and then the difference gets identified. And I'm just wondering, because it was put in the chat a little bit that one can't be Jewish and Christian at the same time, but one can be, say, Jewish and American at the same time. And you're right. I think you pointed to this earlier, that Jewishness has an element of both, right? A religion and an ethnic identity. And so I'm just wondering how that complicates the story just a little bit more than, say, if the Vietnamese child was being adopted by a different family. That I think that if we were to do a comparison, you would see the same sort of racial transaction going on. And yet I think the Jewishness complicates it in perhaps a positive way. And perhaps you can speak to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to choose between many different things that I'm thinking of in response. So, I mean, it is interesting in sort of how in this book where the only characters are the members of the Stein family and this baby they're adopting, that the other members of the Stein family represent whiteness. If they were comparing the Stein family to their Presbyterian neighbors, maybe they wouldn't represent whiteness in the same way. Like all of a sudden they wouldn't have an unmarked identity, that, all of a sudden their identity would be marked. Which is also not a coincidence, because historically part of how race has evolved is through contrast. So someone can sort of become more white through comparison with someone who's less white. It's like, well, you're not this, so therefore people, that's part of how, part of the evolution that sort of led to the way that people think about whiteness now. There's another piece of something that you said. Another direction, another aspect of this, I think, is that people talk about identity as though it's answering one question, when it's actually answering a lot of questions. And those questions, all the answers to all of those questions may not point in the same direction. So if we're really trying to understand people, we wouldn't just say, what are you? You're this. We would ask things like, what kind of culture influenced your upbringing? What genetic inheritance influenced what kind of diseases you might be predisposed to? What do people think you are when they see you? Which may have nothing to do with anything in your history, but that's how people treat you and what you experience socially. How do people perceive your name? How do the groups that you're a member of conceptualize identity, right? Because we have whole, categories of people who were Jewish enough to be killed by Nazis, but not Jewish enough to be recognized in Jewish communities. So there's, if we look at all those different aspects of identity, we can get a sort of more well-rounded picture of kind of what it is and the role that it plays in someone's life. And we can be more open to different kinds of identity doing different work, so that being Jewish is in some ways similar to being Christian structurally, in some ways not. That there are things that it has in common and things that are different. And to be able to actually embrace those differences instead of leveling them into sort of boxes of the social ladder where it's like, check one, you are one thing and all things are the same.
Yes, thank you. I guess I come from a perspective where I look at South Asian religions. I'm actually not looking so much at Judaism or anything in the United States. And there we, myself included, but also students, we struggle with this notion that you can participate in so many different religions, right, and practices, and it doesn't necessarily impact your identity, which may actually be very important even in that particular moment. And so it's striking that here we have the language of a kind of racial identity being prominent, whereas I think we sometimes impute a kind of religious identity as being important, where in some cultural contexts that's not so important, if that makes sense. I think it's just in keeping with the conversation that you got here, is that there isn't just a one box that anybody can check. And yet it does seem that those who belong to more marginalized communities have more pressure to check that box and explain why they don't fit in that box.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And in the case of this book, I mean, and there are whole debates to be had about sort of what does it mean to be Jewish? What kind of thing is it to be Jewish? Is it cultural? Is it religious? Is it, like all the different ways, or do you need all of them? Do you need some of them? Are some more important than others? I think in this particular book, is emphasizing Jewish belonging. I mean, we only looked at a few pages, but every single thing they show about the identity of the family is something Jewish. It's at every moment, nothing American actually, but everything is something Jewish specifically. Like there are no flags or state things or anything like that. But like there's a Shabbat scene. There's like at every moment there's things that sort of emphasize this family as a Jewish family, so that part of the story the book is telling is a story of becoming part of the Jewish people. So this book is emphasizing that in a particular, in a way that focuses on Jewish ritual and practice and peoplehood.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mbuvi, for being with us, albeit remotely and online. And I'm so much looking forward to tomorrow's presentation. So those of you that are here, thank you for coming. It will be an abrupt end because it's a webinar, but I encourage you to join us tomorrow evening for another presentation by Dr. Mbuvi.